Welcome back to Ben's Book Summaries, where we break down thought-provoking books. The ones that really get you thinking.
Ready to dive in.
Absolutely. Today we're looking at Think Again by Adam Grant. You picked this one.
Yeah, think again. The power of knowing what you don't know.
Okay, so, full title and all. So what is it about this book that's making waves?
Well, to start, Adam Grant is a pretty interesting guy. He's an organizational psychologist.
That Warden.
Yeah, Wharton. And he's a best-selling author and a popular TED speaker. So his work, focuses on how we can rethink our approaches to things like motivation, generosity, and even creativity.
So we're talking about someone who's like an expert in thinking about thinking. That's pretty meta.
Yeah, exactly. And again, it really brings all of that expertise together.
Yeah.
It basically calls for us to reconsider our beliefs and our habits. And Grant argues that in a world that's constantly changing, rethinking is key to
Totally right.
success and happiness.
And this book has really resonated with a lot of people.
It has. The New York Times bestseller and, praise for its practical insights and how it's written is really engaging.
Okay, so we know Grant is the real deal and the book's a hit. But what's this rethinking thing all about?
Well, one of the first things Grant tackles is how we often cling to old information, even when, we're quick to update other parts of our lives.
Like our phones, right. We'll trade in our phones in a heartbeat for the new model.
Exactly. But our opinions, we can be surprisingly resistant to change.
It's almost like we're holding onto those old flip phones,
Yeah.
with the cracked screen, but totally convinced that they're still the best.
Exactly. And Grant, he calls this seizing and freezing. Where our beliefs become rigid.
Before our bodies do, I'm assuming.
Long before. He uses this analogy of someone clinging to Windows 95, but laughing at other people who still do.
That's funny because I was thinking about how I stuck to the same workout for years, even though it wasn't working.
Oh, yeah.
Because I seized and froze on that one.
It happens. We all do it. And the problem is, in a world that's, constantly changing, holding on to that outdated information can hold us back.
In all sorts of ways.
Yeah.
So what's the answer to this seizing and freezing? How do we break free?
Well, Grant argues that the key is to just embrace the power of rethinking. We need to be more comfortable with uncertainty, and to see changing our minds as a strength, not a weakness.
Which is a pretty big shift for a lot of us.
Especially, yeah, in a culture that, really values being right and sticking to your guns.
Absolutely. But, does Grant offer any evidence to support this whole rethinking thing?
Oh, tons. He highlights, for example, research that shows that when you change your answer on a test, you actually end up getting more answers right. It
Interesting.
really debunks that whole myth of always go with your first instinct.
Okay, so sometimes second-guessing ourselves can actually be a good thing.
It can. He also talks about a study of Italian startups. And the entrepreneurs that were trained to think, more scientifically, they were much more successful. And the reason is because they approached their business strategies as hypotheses.
Like they were testing them out, right?
Yeah, and their customer interviews were like experiments. Their products were prototypes. So they were constantly iterating and refining, as they learned new information.
So basically applying the scientific method to every part of life.
Exactly. And always being willing to test out those assumptions and update our beliefs based on the evidence.
Okay, so we're starting to see how beneficial rethinking can be. But if it's so great, why do we resist it so much?
Well, one reason is because we tend to fall into what Grant calls the overconfidence cycle.
Okay.
When we hold on to the wrong opinion.
Especially if, people around us agree.
Yeah, it gives us this false sense of certainty.
Like we dig in our heels even more.
Exactly. And social media can make this even worse with all those echo chambers and filter bubbles.
Because we're only surrounded by people who agree with us.
Exactly. And it makes it so much harder to even question our own assumptions.
So how do we break free of that cycle?
Grant suggests a few strategies. And one of the most powerful ones is detaching our opinions from our identity.
Okay, how do we do that?
He suggests two ways. First, detaching your past self from your current self.
Recognizing that you've evolved over time, right? It's like looking back at those old photos of yourself and cringing at those fashion choices, you know what I mean?
Exactly. Like, you can acknowledge that your past self held certain beliefs, but your present self, you've grown, you've learned from new experiences.
Okay, I like it. What's the second way?
It's separating your opinions from, your overall identity. So instead of defining yourself by what you believe, define yourself by your values.
Okay, that's an interesting distinction. So how does that work?
Well, think of it this way. Your values are like your foundation, right? Your compass guiding you. But opinions, they're more fluid. They can change as you learn and grow.
Okay, so if your core value is, let's say, helping others, your opinions on how best do that will probably change as you learn more.
Exactly. Grant gives this powerful example in the book about lobotomies and how defining yourself as a, lobotomist versus having the value of protecting health would lead to very different outcomes.
Yeah, I could see how clinging to that first definition could be problematic.
Yeah.
Okay, so if we detach our opinions from our identity, does that mean we just have to be wrong all the time?
Well, Grant actually dedicates a whole chapter to what he calls the joy of being wrong. And he talks about, highly successful people like a Nobel Prize winner and people who, forecast election.
Then they all enjoy being wrong?
They embrace it, yeah. And Grant says it's because they share this key trait. They're afraid of being wrong in the long run, so they're much more open to being wrong in the short run.
So they see mistakes as an opportunity to learn.
Yeah, they're constantly questioning and testing and refining their thinking. And so in the long run, they're actually more right.
So they're playing the long game, being wrong today, so they can be closer to the truth tomorrow.
Exactly. And he says this mindset can be really liberating. Like, it frees us from always having to be right. And it lets us embrace the learning process even when we make mistakes.
Yeah, I can see that. It does make you wonder if we should all just, be a little less afraid of making mistakes.
Absolutely. And you know what? Grant gives us a whole bunch of tools in the book about how to get better at rethinking, not just for ourselves, but also when we're interacting with others.
Which is exactly what we'll be looking at in part 2 of this deep dive into Think Again.
Looking forward to it.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Adam Grant's Think Again. In part 1, we talked about the benefits of rethinking and some of the reasons why we tend to resist it.
Yeah, the overconfidence cycle and detaching our opinions from our identity. Oh, and the joy of being wrong.
Right, right. And I'm really curious about how these ideas, they play out when we're interacting with others.
Especially, yeah, when we're disagreeing, those tricky conversations.
Yeah, exactly. So how does Grant approach that?
Well, he has this whole chapter on arguing, but he compares it to a dance, not a war.
Arguing is a dance? That's interesting. How does that work?
Well, he looked at expert negotiators.
Okay.
And he found that they approach these arguments differently. Like they ask a lot more questions than they make statements.
So they're not trying to
Dominate. Yeah. And they're genuinely curious about the other person's perspective.
So it's more about understanding.
Yeah, than winning.
Makes sense. Like when I get into those heated debates with family about politics.
Oh, yeah.
We both just dig in our heels.
Yeah.
Nobody changes their mind. It's like a war.
It is. That's the war approach. And Grant says if we want better conversations,
More productive.
yeah, we need that dance mindset.
Okay, so how do we learn to argue like a dancer?
Well, one technique is motivational interviewing.
I've heard of that.
Yeah, psychologists developed it to help people change their behavior, and it really emphasizes asking open-ended questions.
Instead of telling someone that they're wrong.
Right. You're listening for change talk and, avoiding that urge to correct people.
It's more about helping them discover their own beliefs.
Yeah, come to their own conclusion.
It's like in the book, Grant talks about using it to convince a CEO to change his leadership style.
Yeah.
He didn't confront him, he just asked him questions.
It's a much more respectful approach.
And it lets them come to that solution on their own.
Right. And he actually talks about this vaccine whisperer in Quebec. I think he's a pharmacist or a doctor. I can't remember.
Okay.
But he uses motivational interviewing to, increase vaccination rates.
By just listening to people's concerns.
Meeting them where they are, yeah.
Interesting. So, okay, we have the dance analogy and motivational interviewing. But are there other things that get in the way of rethinking?
One big one is this thing called binary bias.
Uh-huh.
We oversimplify things.
Make it us versus them.
Right, exactly. And it makes it really hard to have those nuanced conversations.
Yeah, the black and white thinking trap.
Yeah, and it's so tempting, especially now with social media. And Grant, he uses climate change as an example. That whole focus on believers versus deniers, it just shuts down the conversation.
Doesn't allow for the complexities of the issue.
Right, all the different viewpoints.
So it's about recognizing that complexity.
Right. Instead of black and white, it's shades of gray. highlight the nuances, the contingencies of any situation.
Embrace the messiness.
Because that's where the real learning happens.
Okay, so we've talked about rethinking ourselves, how we interact with others. What about rethinking, like, bigger systems, like education?
Yeah, he argues that traditional education, it prioritizes rote learning, like memorization.
Over critical thinking.
Yeah, which leaves kids unprepared for a world that's always changing.
It's ironic. We're preparing them for a future that we can't even predict.
That's
But we're using these old methods.
right, and he actually highlights the study where they taught elementary school students wrong scientific concepts, and then they looked at how difficult it was to correct those misconceptions later on.
So the longer you believe something, the harder it is to unlearn.
Exactly. So he emphasizes teaching kids how to rethink from the beginning, like how to be more flexible in their thinking.
Makes sense. And I mean, it's not just science, right? Like history textbooks, they change as we get more evidence.
He even tells a story about his own kids, saying that things he learned in school are wrong now, like Pluto being a planet.
I remember that. It was a big deal.
Yeah. But it's a good reminder that knowledge is always evolving.
So how do we create a learning environment where kids can rethink, where it's okay to be wrong?
He shares some really cool examples from his own teaching and also from other educators. One example is this assignment where students have to challenge conventional wisdom. So they create like mini TED Talks or podcasts.
To debate different ideas.
Yeah, so they get to be the experts, make their own arguments.
I love that.
He also talks about confusion time, like giving students the space to really grapple with complex issues without giving them the right answer right away.
Sometimes confusion is a sign that you're actually thinking.
Exactly. It's like when you're working on a hard puzzle.
Yeah, it's frustrating, but you feel like you're stretching those mental muscles.
Yeah. And he highlights the work of this educator, Ron Berger. He talks about critique sessions where students give each other feedback, like specific kind feedback, on the work, not the person.
That's a good skill to learn, period.
It is, and it creates this culture of psychological safety.
Where it's okay to try new things.
Yeah, to be wrong. And that's so important, not just for learning, but also for workplaces, for innovation.
Yeah, I was just going to say, we need that in the workplace, too.
He did a study at Google, and psychological safety, that was the biggest factor in how well teams performed.
Interesting. So if we want more creative, adaptable teams,
we need to make people feel safe to speak up, to challenge things, to say, hey, I was wrong.
Shift from fear to learning.
Exactly. And that takes effort from everyone, especially leadership.
Okay, so we've talked about rethinking personally, how we interact with others, these big systems like education. What about, like, our own life plans? Should we be rethinking those too?
That is a great question, and Grant addresses it directly in the book. He says, yes, like just as much as our opinions.
Makes sense. Sometimes we get stuck in a rut, following a path that, well, maybe it made sense before, but not now.
Yeah, he calls it identity foreclosure. Like, we decide who we are without really exploring other options.
Closing doors before we even know what's behind them.
Exactly. And this happens in all areas of life, but he focuses on career choices. Like, we ask kids, what do you want to be when you grow up? As if they have to have it all figured out.
And then we push them down that one path, even if it's not the right fit.
He talks about his own brother, Ryan, who, wanted to be a neurosurgeon, went through all that training, but then he realized it wasn't right for him.
I bet that was hard after all that time and effort.
It was. But his point is that it's okay to change your mind, to rethink those big decisions. He says we should have checkups on our careers, our relationships, making sure they still fit with our values.
Not giving up on our dreams.
But making sure they're still our dreams.
Right. And that they're not outdated or someone else's version of what we should be doing.
Exactly. And he applies this to happiness, too. Like, we need to rethink how we pursue it.
Because if we're always chasing some external definition, we're going to be disappointed.
Right. Instead, focus on meaning, purpose, doing things for others.
So it all ties back to values, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Building a life that feels authentic and fulfilling, even if it looks different than we thought it would.
It takes courage, though, to let go of the old scripts.
It does.
Okay, so we've covered rethinking our beliefs, our interactions, systems, even our life plans. It feels like a lot. Where do we even start?
Well, Grant gives a lot of tips, but one of the simplest is just ask more questions.
Like what kinds of questions?
What evidence would change my mind? Or what am I missing here? Just approach things with curiosity, with humility, be open to new information.
Stay flexible. Sounds like a good place to start. I think we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. Ready to wrap things up?
Yeah. Let's go.
Welcome back to part 3 of our deep dive into Think Again. We've talked about a lot. Personal rethinking, challenging systems, even like those big life plans.
Yeah, and some strategies, like
Yeah,
arguing like a dance or embracing those moments where you're just like confused.
right, right. Before we finish up, I'm curious about rethinking in the workplace.
Yeah.
I mean, we spend so much time at work, so it seems pretty important, you know?
Absolutely. Grant talks a lot about that. He says rethinking it's crucial for success in any job, but especially now. Like things change so fast, companies have to innovate all the time.
Or else they end up like Blockbuster, right? Or
Mm.
Kodak, clinging to those old ways while everyone else moves on.
Yeah, exactly. He uses the example of BlackBerry. They were like the leaders in smartphones. But then touchscreens and apps, they missed the boat.
Because they were so focused on what worked before.
Yeah, stuck in the past. A cautionary tale for sure. But he also talks about companies that get it right, like like Pixar.
Pixar, yeah.
What do? They've built this culture where it's okay to disagree, to like challenge things. They have these brain trust meetings where anyone can give feedback on the films.
No matter what their job is.
Yeah, everyone. So it's like built-in constructive criticism,
Well,
encouraging people to think differently.
and that leads to more creativity.
Exactly. And Grant, he says leaders have to be willing to admit they're wrong too. Model that humility.
Because if the leaders aren't open to new ideas,
It's going to be hard for everyone else.
right. He even suggests having like chief rethinking officers.
Yeah, people whose job it is to question everything, find those blind spots.
So you always have that devil's advocate.
Yeah, keeping everyone on their toes. But it's not just those big decisions, you know? Grant says rethinking is important for like everyday stuff too.
The small stuff, too.
Yeah. Using checklists, avoiding those careless mistakes, especially in jobs where those mistakes have big consequences, like medicine or flying planes.
Right, where even a tiny error can be a big deal.
Mhm.
So rethinking isn't just about, those big groundbreaking ideas.
It's about always looking for ways to improve, even the small things.
And being open to feedback.
Yes. Positive and negative. We all have blind spots.
So asking for feedback is important.
Yeah. And being able to like take that criticism, it's all about learning.
Creating that environment where people feel safe to, ask questions, admit when they don't know something, to share ideas.
And that helps everyone, the individual, the team, the whole company.
This has been a really thought-provoking deep dive. Think. Again, it's really made me question, well, everything.
Me too. It's one of those books that sticks with you, makes you think differently.
So as we wrap up this episode of Ben's Book Summaries, what's the one thing you want listeners to take away from Think Again?
I think it's that rethinking. It's not like a one-time thing. It's not a destination. It's a journey. You're always questioning, exploring,
It's
evolving.
ongoing.
Yeah. And you need curiosity, humility. You got to be okay with like not knowing everything.
Embrace the unknown.
Exactly. Keep those scientist goggles on, listeners, and be open to changing your mind.
Great advice. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Think Again. And for more book explorations, well, stay tuned to Ben's Book Summaries. We'll help you unlock the power of knowledge, one page at a time.